Hello and welcome to another video review. This is War of the Roses for PC. Special thanks to Fusion Bunny for sending me the House of Lancaster and House of York skin packs. This is a third-person action game by Fat Shark and published by Paradox Interactive. It was released in October of last year, and it was kind of an interesting release because it got compared a lot to Chivalry Medieval Warfare, which was released shortly thereafter. And it was also compared a lot to Mount & Blade simply because of the way the combat plays out. I'll get to that in a moment. But Chivalry and War of the Roses are very different styles of game, and it kind of is an unfair comparison in some ways, which, again, I'll get to later. But anyway, Fat Shark also brought you Lead and Gold Gangs of the Old West. I've already done a My Thoughts on video for that, as well as Chivalry, of course. And I didn't really like Lead and Gold all that much. It was okay at best. And so I was kind of concerned about War of the Roses. I was looking forward to the release, of course, because multiplayer Mount & Blade, sure, whatever. Although Mount & Blade's multiplayer is kind of wonky sometimes, so naturally I was looking forward to something that maybe was more refined like this. And I figured since it was a multiplayer-only game, they would, of course, balance it out for that and really optimize the multiplayer experience as opposed to Warband, where it was almost tacked on. So, the question there becomes, how is it compared to, say, multiplayer Mount & Blade, or does it really bring anything new to the table, and just how is it overall? And that is kind of an interesting question, which I'll get to why that is in a moment. But first, let's talk about the presentation, which is kind of all over the place. On the one hand, you have the environments, which are very large for the most part, and pretty well detailed. And it's kind of weird because the older maps that came with this game actually run a lot better than the new maps. The new maps being the ones that are set in the snow, and of course, I believe the castle, which has a lot of rain effects. I think these particle effects make the performance absolutely terrible, but I'm not 100% sure on why they don't run very well at all. And this isn't just on my system. I know my system isn't that powerful anymore. But even on people with high-end systems, there's lots of reports of the snow maps not running well at all. So they need to do something to fix that. And it's kind of sad because there is barely any variety in the maps at all. I mean, you've got those snow maps, you've got a forest map, you've got a castle, which is, it's always raining, and then you've got a field, basically, with a few buildings here and there. That's pretty much it. I mean, there's some hills and such, but there's really not a lot of variety in the maps, even though they are pretty well detailed, and the forest map and the field maps especially look very nice with their nice green pasture look. So you've got environments that look pretty nice, and they're obviously designed for large numbers of players. I mean, they are pretty large maps, but they're offset by poor performance, so that's a pretty big problem. Then there's the modeling and animation, and of course the textures as well. The textures are fairly high res, all things considered. They're certainly higher res than console textures. You're not actually seeing that in this particular video because I can't really run this thing on anything higher than low without it running like total crap, particularly when there's a lot of players on a server. But anyway, but the texture quality itself is rather nice, so they've done a good job with that, even though there are a few here and there that just seem to have odd color schemes to them. Meanwhile, the modeling is top-notch, very well detailed, and very nice and sharp, so they've done a very good job with the modeling. The animations, on the other hand, are very bipolar. On the one hand, you have the very, very smooth and fluid execution animations, which flow together very nicely, and they're suitably brutal. And then you have the actual animations for when you're just running around or when you're swinging your weapons or whatever. And you look like a robot. What I mean by that is when you actually go to swing your sword, for instance, when you tap the mouse button to attack, it goes into the charge-up mode, I guess is the best way to say it. And the idea there is that you can hold the button down to charge up a power attack and then swing with great power. But if you just want to do a quick attack, then it still holds that position for a split second before it swings. So the animations seem very jerky and do not chain together at all. So You can't actually do combos in this game, and partly because of the animations being all jerky and everything. So those animations are a pretty annoying thing because those are tied in with the gameplay, which I'll get to in a moment. And then there's the sound design, which is actually the better part of the presentation because they've done a really good job with the sound effects for the most part. I mean, there are some sound effects for when you're getting hit with weapons that make just odd noises, and they sound kind of cheesy. But everything else sounds great. And then there's the music, which is, it works. It doesn't really pop in all that much. It's basically during the menus, and that's about it. But they've done a pretty good job with it, and it fits the game pretty well. And the voice acting is somewhat cheesy, but it's actually appropriate. So it's not overly cheesy and just absurd. It actually works out pretty well for the game. So they've done a good job with the presentation, apart from the severe performance problems. But what about the gameplay? And ultimately it does come down to the gameplay because there's pretty much no story apart from the backstory of the game, which is that it takes place during the War of the Roses, which, if you don't know what that is, it was the war for the succession to the English throne between the House of Lancaster and the House of York. And that's actual English history, and it was actually a pretty big deal because it started the Tudor dynasty. So it's got that backstory, but the actual in-game storyline is completely non-existent. It's just multiplayer battles, and they happen to be part of this war. So that's all you're getting as far as story goes. As far as the gameplay goes, I'm going to talk about the setup for the game before I actually get into the actual specifics of the game. You have a class-based system where you get a series of base classes that are fairly well-rounded and give you a general idea of how things are different depending on what you set up your classes to be. And you also get the option of custom classes, which you have to unlock. Now you have to unlock these by getting to a certain level in the progression, as well as getting a certain amount of coins to actually purchase the slot, so to speak. Coins are earned through normal play, so it's not like you can go through the game and not get any coins or anything. You get them at a fairly good rate for the most part, particularly if you do well during a match. So it's kind of weird then that you have this system where you can actually buy the coins with real money. So putting microtransactions into a full-fledged multiplayer game that you just buy to begin with it's iffy. I'm not sure whether I truly dislike this or not. It seems like a bit of a shady practice to be able to just skip the progression altogether. Although you do still have to get up to a certain level to actually unlock certain items, so it kind of balances itself out in that a bit. But as far as the class setup goes, you can select a main weapon as well as 5 perks and a sidearm, and you can also choose your dagger if you wish. You can also choose a helmet and, of course, your armor, which you have a good selection of with all of these items. With perks, you get 5 perks, each of them being a different thing. And you can get things like, say, the infantry perk, which allows you to get further perks that will improve your abilities in basically melee combat. Each perk slot, the 5 slots, has 2 sub-slots where you can get 2 sub-perks, which have their own bonuses and such. Like, for instance, the archer sub-perks, a couple of them give you bonuses like improving your ability to do the quick reload with crossbows, where it's a sort of mini-game when you reload to where you have to hold the button down and it will wind up the crossbow, and if you click the left mouse button at the right time, then it will increase the speed with which you reload. So that's something to help that out. There's also things that say lower the arc of fire that you have on these projectiles, which can be pretty ridiculous at times, as well as things like faster drawing times on your normal bows and such like that. So that's basically what the sub-perks would do, and you can, by choosing certain perks, dictate what you can actually do. For instance, the archery perk is required to actually be able to use bows and crossbows, whereas the cavalry perk is, of course, required to use horses. So there is incentive to actually go into these custom classes and fiddle around with them. And you do have to unlock certain things by your level. So if you want, say, a certain type of sword that's unlocked at, say, level 20, then you have to actually reach level 20 and then buy it with the coins to actually be able to use it. Now, the interesting thing they've set up with the weapons is that you have several different types of weapons, of course, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. For instance, swords are the most easy to use, so to speak, but at the same time they're really not because of the armor you'll be fighting. Only a thrust will actually do damage against plate mail. Otherwise it just negates the damage altogether. So you might want to use, say, an axe or a mace, which just gets through the armor no problem. So each of those has their own specific sets of weapons. Like for swords, there's several different types of one-handed swords. There's only two types of great sword, which two-handed sword, and those are the Scottish sword and a sword that they added in with the Knights Hospitaller update, I believe. But nobody uses it because it's extremely expensive, and the Scottish sword is better in every way. So there's things like that. There's also, of course, pole arms that you can use, and if you want to be very effective on horseback, you can, of course, put in a lance. As far as the armor goes, there are three basic types. You have light, medium, and heavy armor, each of them with their own, of course, levels of protection. The medium is generally a good mix of the two. Heavy armor would be plate, and it renders you pretty much impervious, but it also is very heavy encumbrance, so you'll have to worry about that. Whereas light armor allows you to move very quickly, but it doesn't protect you very much. So again, that's something you need to keep in mind. And something you'll notice very quickly is that even though you have the options of these things, most people tend to use either medium or heavy armor, because light actually makes it harder to play. So it's kind of weird how they set that up. But you can also customize your armor and, of course, your helmets and such as you feel like. Well, you can unlock certain paint jobs on the armors for various coin amounts. They seem kind of high, actually, so I haven't done that. But what you will see is that I've used the House of Lancaster paint because I prefer it over the House of York paint. But suffice to say, it changes the way your armor looks, and so there's quite a bit of customization options available to you in the as far as the armor goes and such like that, and how it looks. You can put crests on things, you can put plumes on helmets and such like that. So it really does render things much more interesting as far as the character customization goes. They give you quite a few options for that. You can also pick what your character's face and their voice. There are currently only two voices, and those are Noble and Commoner, I believe. And they just sound slightly different. It's just the way they say things, so it's pretty much the same stuff. You'll hear either one. But the faces, you can select a facial architecture, so to speak, and then the look of the face, and these will change depending on what you've selected as your architecture and such like that. So that creates some customization options there. They could do better with it, though. But ultimately, this class system is a problem, and that's because they haven't really balanced out the game all that well. In particular, certain weapons feel very overpowered compared to others, like, for instance, the Scottish sword. Against plate armor, it still does damage when you slash, whereas with a one-handed sword, you literally have to thrust to actually do any damage against plate armor. Even when you're behind the enemy, when you hit them in a weak spot, you have to thrust. And the hitboxes on a lot of these items are very, very precise. So, for instance, if you're using a pole arm with a very long haft to it, and then you have to actually hit with the direct head of the weapon to actually do any real damage with it, if you hit them with the haft of the weapon instead of the head of the weapon, it actually won't do any damage. So you have to pay a lot of attention to what you're doing on a lot of these weapons. Otherwise, they're just not going to work. Hence why swords are supposedly the easiest to use. But considering most people tend to use heavy armor in this game, or medium armor, where slashing is very ineffective, and heavy armor, which is it's completely immune to slashes, unless you're using the Scottish sword, or an axe, for instance. The swords become extremely underpowered, so it's kind of a weird balancing act, and they haven't really done a good job of it, again, because the Scottish sword allows you to actually do damage against it. Now, They've also set up the ranged weapons to be fairly well balanced compared to everything else. Good luck hitting things because you do have that arc of fire, and you do have to really get used to how the thing works. Now, against heavy armor, even the crossbow is pretty underpowered. I've gotten headshots with it, and it hasn't dropped an enemy. Whereas if I'm fighting, say, someone in medium armor, or especially light armor, it's either an insta-kill, or it just downs them instantly. Now, when I say down them, most of the kills you'll see in this game, you actually knock somebody down, and then they can either yield, and they'll respawn, and it of course counts as a kill, or they can be revived by one of their teammates, or they can be executed. Executed is kind of a weird thing, because it requires you to go through a specific animation, and if that animation does not complete, then it doesn't actually trigger. So you can have it to where a guy gets stabbed repeatedly in the face and he's still able to be revived because reasons. It's kind of annoying. And it really just takes you out of the game when that sort of thing happens. It's pretty annoying. But that all ties in with the combat system. And the combat system is the real problem with this game right now. Apart from, of course, performance issues that are just ridiculous right now, and numerous bugs that I'll talk about in a moment. Now, I've mentioned all of the stuff up to this point being somewhat unbalanced in the class system, while having a lot of customization options, that being very well appreciated. It doesn't really seem to balance out all that well. They tried to make it a bit more balanced by allowing you to choose very specific things for your weapons, like the edge grind on swords and stuff like that, the type of material it's made of, the fighting style you're using and stuff like that. But ultimately, it allows you to exploit the game. And exploiting the game is the biggest problem as far as the gameplay goes, because everybody has to do it or they lose. So what ends up happening is that you'll see a bunch of people running around in heavy armor with Scottish swords and not a lot else. Occasionally you'll see somebody trying to use a crossbow like me, but that tends not to happen all that much. And if you get onto a larger map, you'll see a lot of people running around on horseback, because a lance actually is an insta-kill most times. So if you manage to hit somebody with a lance on horseback, they're done. It's end of story. They're gone. So that's a pretty annoying thing. I mean, it makes total sense, don't get me wrong, but it's still pretty annoying. Now, luckily, the lance actually does break very quickly, so it kind of levels itself out very quickly. But it's still very annoying when that sort of thing happens. It's especially bad when you get a team that is composed primarily of guys on horseback, because then they just run circles around you and you get annihilated very quickly. Which, again, makes sense, but it's still really annoying. Whereas with the, say, crossbow or longbow, then you don't have to worry about being downed by it very easily unless you're in light or medium armor, because it's just not going to do all that much damage against you unless you get really good hits on them. For instance, if you hit an enemy with his visor open and you hit him in the head, then it's going to do a lot of damage. But if his visor's down, then it's not going to do much damage at all. So you really have to aim for the head a lot with the ranged weapons in this game. Otherwise, you're just not going to be able to take anybody down. So they actually made the archers and crossbowmen kind of underpowered. Now, they could balance that out a bit by making them do slightly more damage. You don't want to make them do too much more damage, because currently they certainly have ways to sort of balance things out by allowing them to pierce armor and such like that. But it's really more of a skill-based thing, so you don't want to make it too much to where the crossbows and especially become very overpowered compared to everything else. But that's pretty hard to do because of those slow reload, and it takes quite a while to do things. So the really big problem with this game from a mechanics standpoint is actually the melee system, which you'd think would be really good because it's based primarily on Mount and Blade system, where you have a four-dimensional attack. You can either do a right slash, a left slash, a downward chop, or you can thrust by moving the mouse in the various directions and hitting the attack button. If you hold it down for longer, then you actually will charge up your attack and do a power attack, which of course would do more damage if you can, of course, hit them in a good spot or something like that. So, in theory, that sounds good, and they also throw in the blocking system from Mount & Blade as well, where you do the same thing, only it's changes the direction of your block. So you have to really pay attention to what your enemy's doing, and it kind of eliminated the feint spamming problem that I saw with Mount & Blade Warband, where the enemy would just fiddle around constantly and not ever actually swing until it was too late, and you could never react to it. Luckily, that's not a problem in War of the Roses. The problem with War of the Roses is that it doesn't usually register your swings as you want it to. For instance, I go to thrust all the time against plate armor, and it never actually registers that as the proper motion. Instead, it tries to do a slash from usually a right direction. So I don't know what's going on there, but it seems to register the very slightest of movement left or right much more easily than it does up or down. Because up is the downward chop, and backwards is, of course, well, down is the thrust. So it gets pretty annoying when you're in a heated melee combat and your guy is never doing what you want him to do. He's constantly slashing instead of thrusting like you want him to, and it gets infuriating when you get taken down so easily because the game is just not doing what you tell it to do. So that's really the biggest problem from a mechanics standpoint. The balancing issues also come into play because, again, it's pretty easy to exploit the game, and that's why you see a lot of people running around with Scottish swords and heavy armor, because there's really nothing else that you can do effectively. So, on top of this, you only have 3 game modes: Team Deathmatch, Pitched Battle, which is Team Deathmatch with no respawns, and Conquest, which is exactly like it is in every other game ever, only the difference being it's War of the Roses. And in this case, it usually devolves into Deathmatch, because ultimately, when you're actually going along and capturing these points, you'll get to a certain point where the enemy is actually caught up, and it just turns into a complete melee. And that's really it. So ultimately, there's really only one game mode, and that's Team Deathmatch. It's pretty annoying because it makes the game feel very stale very quickly, which it shouldn't be. And it's particularly annoying because nobody plays Pitched Battle. Why would they have a reason to? It's kind of annoying, actually. And barely anyone plays Conquest, because why would they? And so it really diminishes the team play aspect of this game. A lot of people would look at something like this and be like, hey, there's these abilities that allow you to boost your teammates' ability to, say, move quickly, or boost their attacking ability and stuff like that. But there's no real reason to use them, because you're not going to be working as a team. It's going to end up as a chaotic melee, almost in every case. And on top of that, you have a very low variety of maps, and it just ends up being a package that is just very, very underwhelming. It's very disappointing. Now, in its current state, it is also very, very buggy. And by buggy, I mean, not only does it have severe performance problems that I've mentioned already, but it also has a problem of whenever I connect to a server, it actually disconnects me instantly, and I have to reconnect to it in order to actually get into the game. I've also had it freeze on the loading screens for no particular reason. It gets pretty annoying when that sort of thing happens. And I'm not talking like these are few and far between. These happen every single time I play the game. And whenever I join a new server, it's always the same case. So I don't know what they did to it, but they need to fix it badly. So ultimately, there's a lot of potential here. And I can see where in future updates, if they add in more game modes that are actually objective-based and really encourage team play, if they try to rebalance the weapons in this game to where not everyone is ending up using the Scottish sword and plate armor, or pole arms and a plate armor or something like that, then I can see where it would be way more enjoyable than it is currently. Because as it stands, it's almost unplayable. It just partly because of the performance, of course, but partly because it's just so frustrating. Ultimately, I would say that if they manage to fix its problems, if they manage to patch it later and improve the balancing to improve that very floaty feel with the melee to where it doesn't seem to recognize what you're trying to do, if they definitely improve the performance problems and really iron out those bugs, then I can see where War of the Roses would be a very enjoyable experience, because it does have quite a bit to offer. But in its current state, I can't recommend it. I give it a 2 out of 5. Thanks for watching.